Thank you all. I know now I go stand before you and either going to sleep or going back to the bar. Thank you, Peter, and thanks for TRA. This is my third time, and now I've broken into the black. I'm standing now for two of them. Some of you maybe, and when I was practically lying down. I was very sick, but I made it through. I'm very happy to be here. A couple of points I want to say beforehand. First of all, for those of you who asked, these pants are red. It's Nantucket red. It's an East Coast thing. If anybody says anything about the guy in the salmon pants, I'll be quite upset. Second, speaking of baseball, does anybody here know what day it is? I told somebody in the elevator, so that person can't answer. What day is today? It is Jackie Robinson Day, number 42, Brooklyn Dodger. It's a major, major day. This is the first time I would not have been at a ballpark. I committed to this. I'm happy. The last point I want to say before I kick into this is I assume that maybe it's you. I really wanted to meet the Rail Daddy. And I was an avid consumer of your product. And I'm also very good friends with Tim O'Toole. And so I said, oh my God, I'm going to come and I'm going to meet he's in New York. This man was known as Rail Daddy, which is the best nickname of all time, in my opinion. And so we miss him. We'd rather have him than our previous governor. That's all I'm going to say on that. And I'm saying that from a Democratic point of view. But afterwards, I would like to come and shake your hand. And I was a big rider of his product in New York. I've done it in Toronto and also in London, where it was just terrific. And Tim was a good friend of mine. So now let's see if I could get this thing rolling. Here it is. So I'm going to talk. Part of the reason I didn't spend more time with you all today and at the cocktail party wasn't just that it was cash bar, although that contributed, but it was because I'm up there listening to Ancora, and so some of you are going to know what I'm talking about. Please feel free to just jump in if you don't. This is I'm a freight-centric person as an analyst. There aren't really many public ways to play what could be a passenger renaissance coming or not. So Ancora is creating I think an existential fight for the soul of the North American freight rail industry, and it's something everybody should be aware of. So let's see. All right, I'm going to go quickly through. I have about 25 slides. I've done that in about 8 minutes, but I realize I'm not in New York, so I'll slow it down a bit. The freight railroads have really 5 distinct advantages here, and I just want to quickly do this to set the stage. They're clearly labor efficient. I spent part of the day today at Alliance, Texas, looking at the intermodal yard. Think about a double-stack train and a number of truck drivers. That also plays into their fuel and also their carbon advantages. Those 3 are huge advantages that will play out more in the future with labor shortages that we may not be in one now, but in general with a tight labor market expected to last. And more importantly, whether we change the name from a sort of toxic ESG to something else, carbon is going to be a big issue, and fuel is a big issue just in terms of cost. However, as we also know, there are a lot of people who are working on chipping away at those advantages that rail has over truck, whether they're doing it under the guise of making more efficient engines for passenger, whatever it is. Autonomy and electric vehicles are going to, if not eliminate, certainly minimize those huge advantages. So the railroads must rely on advantages 4 and 5. Number 4 is the infrastructure advantage. The freight rail system has a B+ rating from the American Society of Civil Engineers, and I keep swapping back and forth between America and North America. I really mean North America, but in this case it is the United States. The highway system got a D in the Civil Engineers, those guys. I can't do that off the top of my head. So this is the moat. Warren Buffett, an owner of a railroad about 10 minutes away from here, talks about the moat you build to protect your investment. For the railroads, it's the fact that they can self-fund their infrastructure. That used to be a disadvantage when the government was subsidizing highways. It's now a tremendous advantage. If they see a new product to develop, a new intermodal lane, nearshoring in Mexico, they can spend their own money, and that's because, number 5, they're in excellent financial condition. They've had a really rough go of it since 2016 or 17, and in that time, they've produced record cash flow. So the rough go of it has to do with expectations and possibilities, not the bottom line cash. If they're facing an existential, I'm going to use that phrase a lot, and I apologize, potentially, if you thought about if you could make trucks platooned, electric, and autonomous today, and after all, truck fleets turn over every 3 to 5 years, right? Railroad fleets with those embedded locomotives take decades to turn over. If you could turn that truck fleet over today, the railroads would lose about a third of their business today. Now, that's not happening. Only states like Texas, where life is cheap, do they let autonomous trucks ride and experiment on the road. That was a Northeast swipe at you guys. But there are others, Nevada, you don't necessarily want to be lumped in with Nevada. But this is sort of a big issue. So here, really want to talk about the three big body blows the freight rail, not the passenger rail industry, but the freight rail industry took. They were part of the supply chain crisis. We all know about that post-pandemic and the recovery, and the railroads were short of crews. There were labor shortages in fast food. There were labor shortages in warehousing and at the shippers and certainly at the ports and at truck drivers and all throughout the supply chain and everything tied to it. But the Surface Transportation Board is a regulatory body that looks only at railroads, and they have hearings. I don't know if there's a regulatory body. In fact, I'm pretty sure there isn't that looks at warehouse workers. So this particular industry got raked over the coals publicly for being inept. They essentially ran an old playbook, which is volumes have crashed in the pandemic, so I'm going to furlough my workers. And when I want them back, the vast majority are going to come back because it's a really good job. Now, two things happened. One, the Great Resignation, whatever we're going to look back and say whether that happened. And two, they hadn't signed a new labor contract because of COVID. It comes every 3 years and there's back pay. So the gap between rail labor and other labor had narrowed. And so people didn't come back. Instead of 80% coming back, roughly 30% came back. There was a new game and an old playbook, and railroads looked inept in the supply chain crisis. Then they had the labor contract come due, and labor played this like a Stradivarius. They had a Democratic administration in Washington. There were well-known labor shortages, as I just described. They used social media. They knew they were going to win this labor round, and they won it big. We also knew there was never going to be a strike. That is just a threatened thing. It's very hard to strike in the rail business because of the Railway Labor Act of 1926. If there had been a strike, it would have lasted about 5 minutes. But they played it to the end because every day they went on, even after the Presidential Emergency Board recommendations, which is essentially what they settled on, every day they waited, there was another signing bonus, another sweetener, one more thing. They played it extremely well. But now you have the railroads as greedy and inept. Right? My mother called me and said, "Why don't you offer paid sick leave?" And my mother's been my mother for all of my life. She obviously doesn't know what I do. One thing I don't do is work for a railroad, and the other thing I don't do is have employees who have sick leaves or not. But my mother asked me that became the big issue of, here's another thing you should learn if you're in a business. You don't want to be on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post. Not only does that normally mean things are going bad, but it means a political writer is now writing about you as opposed to a transportation writer. So that's what happened to us. And again, keep in mind where I live and how you can figure out my politics. It was bad. And then East Palestine happened, and that was universally bad. So railroads were greedy, inept, and now dangerous. I want to point out that we have not heard the NTSB report. I'll talk about East Palestine in a second. But the railroads need to change this narrative. They began with 3 investor conferences. This industry is investor-owned, including BNSF, which is owned by one investor, Berkshire Hathaway. But they began to talk about growth and the growth pivot to growth. Take the cost-cutting they've done and pivot to growth, and so that we'll see how that played out. Here are the 3 conferences. And what's really ironic is that 2 of the railroads that talked about pivoting to growth, about building in resiliency, because railroads historically had gotten worse in service as volume came back. And they surely did it in the pandemic recovery when all of you guys were buying, exercise bikes. What's the brand name? Help me out. Pelotons, right? And not going to Disney. And when that happened, railroads were short of crews. That was an extreme example of railroads under positive duress, not handling it very well. We used to call that a rich person's problem, but ultimately it leads to lack of confidence in the shipper. These 3 investor conferences, it's when managers put their draw a line and they say, this is what we're going to do, and this is what we're going to do over the next several years, and how you should judge us. How do you value us? What is our management attempting to do? And these 3 big railroad companies, if you can't see it, I could barely see it, but Norfolk Southern was the first, Canadian National was the second, and then the great CPKC in their debutante's ball, which I see is misspelled there, they all came out, and the phrase operating ratio or margin did not occur once in 300 slides. And I thought, since these guys are doing what I've always said they should do, they must be really smart. as opposed to thinking whether I was wrong. But we're still waiting for CSX and Union Pacific, which have relatively new management teams, to come out. Now, again, Investor Days may not mean much to you, but it really sets the tone. Norfolk Southern was really trying to build a resilient railroad, a customer-first railroad. They were not trying to be inefficient. They certainly weren't trying to be unsafe. I think it's pretty clear we'll see that that accident could have happened at any railroad. It's very rare. In fact, one of the things, I think my next slide might be about that. Yes. Was the thing that gets me the most mad is the U.S. government is the unindicted co-conspirator in the East Palestine accident. I should actually change that phrase to incident. To be an accident, you have to break out the Band-Aid box. Nobody was injured. Nobody was killed, thank God. Yes, it was nasty. It was telegenic. $1.4 billion so far has been spent on recovery and future efforts to make sure the water is clean. I do not mean to minimize how scared you must have been if you lived in that community, a community where 13 Norfolk Southern employees lived. The reaction to the threat was unbelievable. Both parties just piled on in front of television. It was crazy. The hot box detectors, which are voluntary, saw that this was happening. The way it was communicated to the engineer, maybe it should have been a few minutes earlier. They disengaged, they moved out. We wait for the NTSB report. But they were carrying goods. The first question is, why are they allowed to carry these goods in public? The answer is they're not allowed to, they're compelled to. They're compelled to because these goods go to factories where people work. The government makes them do it. They, in the past, have tried to get out from the common carrier obligation to carry these goods, led by Norfolk Southern. That's been denied. BNSF has also made efforts to price only for new tank cars versus old ones. And the government has essentially said if it's a legal product, an illegal car, you must make a reasonable effort to carry those goods. So they did. There was an accident that could have happened at any railroad, and the world has never really been the same in the rail world. I think they've been attacked for having lobbyists. Remember, labor has lobbyists, shippers have lobbyists, everybody has lobbyists. That's how we do business in government. But they were trying to hold back what could have been an intense overreaction. They were able to get the two-man crew mandate regulated and not legislated, which would have made it semi-permanent. There were 3 people on the locomotive. Everybody, you quoted Churchill thinking of the war rooms, et cetera, never let a good crisis go unused. So everybody came out of the woodwork to talk about this. People were talking about the length of trains that they don't like here in Texas, for example. That was not a particularly long train, had 3-man crews, et cetera. I think the railroads have suffered a huge reputational hit from this. The general public perceives them to be unsafe, which is not true. That's why they carry these goods, because they're the safest mode. My mother called up and said, well, why don't you just have 2-man crews? It seems to make sense. I'm like, well, I don't know, Mother. Why does it make sense? And then we got in an argument. We haven't talked since Christmas. So this is the big issue. So subsequent to that, Norfolk Southern announces a move to essentially a long-term plan in December of 2022. The key word, they're going to build resilience. They're not going to use the playbook of laying people off drastically because all of them will come back, when in fact not all of them come back, and then hiring hard, training long, installing difficult, and then having inexperience painful is a high cost. The ROI, return on investment, is way too much. And what it does to the shipper, who's essentially turned away from the roads and a great deal of goods, carload, which peaked about 2008, intermodal, which peaked in 2018. You know, this is a part of it. And they said, we need to change the playbook and change the way we do business. And I called it the Great Experiment. And unfortunately, they came out and they started this in what was a freight recession. These are J.B. Hunt's term, but everybody's picked up. And they had East Palestine. Again, could have happened anywhere, but it did take out the main line, cost them $1.4 billion, and meant their management wasn't managing. They were spending a lot of time in Washington, D.C., if not in East Palestine, Ohio. So activist investors, who often could be smart, good people, were running down to the bottom of the barrel here with Ancora. They saw a slower antelope in the herd, and like a hyena, that's the one they attacked. And I'm using the analogies on purpose. Their decision that Alan Shaw wasn't fit to do this, I just read through a 193-page deck during your cocktail hour, and it is completely filled with BS. And I'm happy to talk about it. I mean, they just outright lies about people that say Steve and I both know, capable rail people from the 90s who implemented PSR, which was a phrase that only came about 2014. So hard to implement that at BNSF in the 90s when it didn't even exist as a strategy. They don't know Hunter Harrison. The person they want to put in at COO to change this about and throw Alan out is somebody that did not grow up he grew up in the vicinity of Hunter Harrison. When he joined CSX in Hunter's last years, he called his old protege at the CPKC, Keith Creel, and said, "Hey, you just sent me somebody you fired. Can you remind me who he is again?" And now that person is claiming to be, Hunter's, illegitimate child. The key thing here is it's the revenge, in my opinion, of the cult of the operating ratio. My peers in the Wall Street community love the operating ratio of the margin. It is, as Keith Creel, who is, I think, the best CEO in the business at CPKC, says, it is the outcome of a process. If you do the following things right, your margin should improve. It's going to improve by being more efficient, and it's going to improve by being more efficient, leading you to have more growth. If you just manage to it and you incent to it, you are incented to cut headcount, to cut costs. That's the easiest way. That is a perversion of PSR. So here's the fight that's going on. It is a fight to put 7 new people in on the board, to get the majority of the board. These people, and I'm happy to talk about them, include one decent railroader, one complete nut bar who Tim O'Toole knew well out of London. It's really ugly, but I think they could win. Because I didn't think they would before, because the previous activists in this space are 4-0-1, to use American football terms, right? There have been 5 activist attacks in the 21st century, starting with the Children's Investment Fund at CSX, which is where I introduced Tim to the TCI, and then CSX thought I had invented proxy fights, and they didn't talk to me for 3 years, and I'd never heard of a proxy fight because the last one had been 1954. I just said Tim was in London. You should talk to him. You're in London. But anyway, going back to that, they won that. Hunter won at CP. Hunter won at CSX. Children's Investment Fund came back and attacked CN. They tied. They got the CEO fired. They didn't get their guy, Jim Venna, in. He's now at Union Pacific. You also notice, and I'll show you in a slide, that the CN is a big part of this story. They're trying to change this game, and I think this time they can be stopped. They really, for this long-term health of the industry, they must be. Those of you who remember Saturday Night Live in the early days when Chevy Chase got up and said, Francisco Franco is still dead. Well, for Franco, substitute Hunter Harrison. Whatever you think of him, he's not there. There is no superstar. You could just say, well, we got to have this guy. Tom Brady's thinking of coming out of retirement. I'm not really an American football guy, but it's astounding to me that he has not said no to coming in next year and playing. Well, that would be somebody if you're an activist. Hey, we have Tom Brady, but they don't have Tom Brady. They've got a guy who was fired at UPS and a guy who was fired at CSX. Doesn't sound like a winning team to me. Union Pacific Sunday surprise. Activists came and knocked out Lance Fritz. He'd been there forever. Many of you probably know Lance. The biggest reasons are a couple of dumb things that they kept their finger on. Holding CapEx to 15% of revenues or less, which only was bailed out because fuel surcharges were so huge, so they were able to spend as they should. Otherwise, that railroad would be in very bad shape. Promoting a G55, which is a 55% operating ratio goal. Again, the operating ratio is the outcome of a process, it's not the end. And really, the biggest is fighting with the STB for stupid things. At my RailTrends conference, in which the chairman of the STB, Marty Overman, got up and really railed against using embargoes, against, when they didn't have enough crews, they would embargo regions, ports, or customers. They did, as he was speaking, they added 100 to it. That kind of poking the bear thing. But the real reason is Union Pacific is very famous for having the best franchise in the business. They say it. Their competitors say, everybody says it. They've got auto, and they've got all the chemical business here in Texas. They've got the Mexican border and 26% of Ferromex. They are the number 2 player in intermodal. They've got a great grain franchise. They got it all, baby. They've got long hauls, and they never quite live up to their potential. That's really why Jim Venna came in. So here, the CN and the mothership, it was at Canadian National that a bunch of folks came together and discovered, or rediscovered, scheduled railroading. Hunter got to use his tools in a big railroad. They were the railroad of the 21st century, for the most part. Maybe BNSF could claim a tie because of what they've done with intermodal, but it would probably they'd be 1A. What's interesting is they are running Union Pacific, they being ex-CN people. They're running CPKC, Union Pacific. They're the COO at Norfolk Southern, and they could be replaced by another COO at Norfolk Southern. They are the COO at CSX. What railroad am I forgetting? Well, CN, obviously they're running CN. So they are really the railroad of the century. Their basic principles, PSR worked in Canada. PSR was pro-customer in Canada. It's over in the US where we got a little greedy and said, let's move the operating ratio down right now, every quarter, year over year. But it's interesting to think that the CN is really the mothership, if any of you guys are Funk fans. The brand new baby railroad is the CPKC. One of the great ways to turn the narrative around is not just to talk about it in an analyst meeting, but to promote growth. And this is the first merger, the last merger of my lifetime, of your lifetimes, but it's the first merger in which 80% of the benefits are expected to be from revenue gains, from growth. All the other mergers that created BNSF or UPSP were 80% duplicative cost removal. This is a whole new ballgame. And I truly believe they're going to do it. Do I believe they're going to do it exactly when they said they're going to do it? They were smart enough to give us about 3 different sets of numbers so they can claim a victory in some of them and maybe not in others. They're all big. They're all going to be good. We're in a freight recession. It may end at the end of this year. Keith Creel, when he spoke at RailTrends, we all volunteered to build a little pool around this to see if he could walk on water as he walked up to the podium. I think he can't necessarily walk on water, but he's close. He doesn't get ankle deep in it. So I'm very excited about that. And that wasn't all I had to say, but maybe somebody's speaking for me. RailTrends, my conference last year, and I do ask you to come, it's terrific. So one of the things about this is Keith, in their merger, they were the first merger to really promote rail-to-rail competition. They are taking dead aim at the north-south business from the Canadian and American Midwest, manufacturing Midwest, straight here to Texas and through Texas into Mexico. That was Union Pacific's business. They were giving a lot of it to KCS at Laredo. They were taking some of it at Eagle Pass. BNSF and Hunt go through Eagle Pass. But that is the one area, that's the one lane where BNSF is number 2, not number 1 to the Union Pacific. So they are definitely increasing rail-to-rail competition in this. They're also going at UP in a couple other ways. They're eliminating areas where they had some bridge carriage and whatnot. They also knew that the STB that regulated the merger thinks that railroads are a monopoly. That's insane on the face of it because if anybody's been out here, there's a highway system, but they don't regulate trucks. They just look at railroads, which is insane. The STB are my friends. I think they do think a lot of funny thoughts, but in some ways I wish they had more power because if you just look at the railroads, it does look duopolistic. But they think that it is this way. So Keith wants his merger passed, so he says, we're going to improve rail-to-rail competition. We're going to bring competition back to the railroad business. So there was a lot of talk of that. But his brand new railroad also inspired an explosion of rail-to-rail cooperation, new press releases, hopefully that leads to business. The most famous being the Falcon service from Canadian National to the Union Pacific to Ferromex at Eagle Pass. And lots of others all around here. So one of the interesting things is that's sort of a split. You have both more cooperation and more competition. What I hope is it sets an entrepreneurial move alight here, more interaction with the short line industry, which I spent a lot of time thinking about, et cetera. And maybe if I'm lucky, oh no, I'm not quite. Mexico's moment. So last year I went down to the Mexican version of the Intermodal Association of North America, their big annual meeting I go to every year in Long Beach. Mexico, I went to Cancun to their first big meeting in AMT, and I went there so you don't have to. So you can thank me for taking that. And it was really interesting. All the big shippers and the railroads there are highly aware of the nearshoring opportunities. Mexico is underperforming its potential, right? It is the economy of the future, and it always will be, is one of the running jokes. It is, they are a quarter of Latin American GDP. They're soaking up 17, 18% of foreign direct investment. They are underperforming. The greatest growth market in North American railroading is cross-border intermodal, yet it's losing share to trucks. For all the excitement, this is a glass half full story. And part of the reason is deeply unstable government on that side, that their unstable government replaced our unstable government, giving you some hint of my voting. But they're running a very high energy economy over there, supporting Pemex, very high carbon. If you're an international player, let's say an automaker, and you're going to build a new plant, do you want to go to a place where you will not hit your carbon targets, where you're going to have high, inefficient, and spotty energy service? There were Constellation Brands, a big beer maker, spent $1 billion building a plant. In the last minute, AMLO decided to have a plebiscite, which he just calls randomly, and they lost $1 billion investment, just wrote it off. This kind of thing makes it very difficult, and the Mexican business community and shipper community is highly aware. There are high hopes in the election coming this June that while the party may win, the woman who is the mayor of Mexico City is described as a technocrat, and every business person can live with a technocrat, right? All they want is stability of law and of regulation, that, you know, in order to make this investment and make Mexico truly have, after about the 5th time since NAFTA started, you know, their moment. And then we have the USMCA up for, you know, appeal reapplication in 2026. So what happens in November here will have a big play on that too. Mexico will always be a great market or a very good market. Let's see if we can make it a great one. They just don't like my Trump references. Let's see. Come on. Well, I think there was a slide that I might have bypassed. I did. It just said short lines to the rescue. Somebody earlier before was talking about there are 600 plus short lines, majority in the U.S. They do a great job of first and last mile. They do a tremendous job. They really can be the retail gathering arm for the big railroads. It's an interesting time. I made a big report, a big case for that, and everybody said that's really good. And I talked to the heads of strategy and CFOs at the Class 1s, and they were like, yeah, that really makes sense. We're not doing it. So, which, by the way, is probably the statement that would be on their tombstone, right? The key thing here is control, but they're all willing to work more. A lot of roads that have suspended short line meetings, you know, big sort of parties, and they bring all the short lines into headquarters and wine and dine and talk about issues. They're all back. I have real hope about that. So is the administrator of the FRA here? The fastest mover from podium to moving car in history. That man gets faster than Bob Hayes for you Texans. So will not take questions. It's unbelievable. So the STB, I think they're post-peak. They're a commercial regulator, right? And as a commercial regulator without any more mergers, and under the new rules, I don't think there will be, they are post-peak. They did do this nasty curveball. I'm a baseball guy. That's a good thing. They made the reciprocal switching rule, looks like it's going to be about service and not about price. That tells me a lot of things. Railroads retain pricing power. What you need to do is be on time or consistent and reliable, and price is not the issue. So that's one thing, and that has kept them in sort of in a job for a while. I call it the STB Full Employment Act. It's also hopefully going to provide really good data for analysts, because right now all of the on-time data is all different. So I think they're not manipulating it per se, but so you can see, why did CSX get better or worse? But you can't compare CSX to Norfolk Southern as much as Ancora is desperately trying to. So I'm hopeful for that. I'm hopeful that we'll get to the end of the STB, Hatfield and McCoy war with the Union Pacific. So the real devil horns here go to the FRA, which is not, contrary to its consistent belief this time, a full employment agency. It's a safety regulator. And so I really argue about, why do they slow walk automated inspection technology in cars and in track and other things like that? I find it painful. The permanent people who are there actually answer that question reasonably. And one of the things they say is that you need to bring in labor, because they'll be implementing this. And so bringing them into the story is great. I went down and visited Duos Technology, which is the largest creator of the portals that you can inspect cars through at speed. And that was really told to us analysts and investors as, look at the capacity. Instead of stopping and walking 1.5 miles, you just roll that train at 60 miles an hour and you get better data through cameras and whatnot. And so they've brought labor in. I know others have, to try to make this a cooperative thing, kind of sidestep the current administration of the FRA, because I think a lot of labor people, once they realize it's not about reducing their numbers, it's about more efficiency that ultimately benefit all of them, I think that could win. I was incredibly impressed at Railway Interchange, if any of you were there, with the permanent head of safety, the non-political head of safety at the FRA. I think his name is Alexi. I think he's super sharp, and it warms my heart that a man that smart and gifted is working in the public sector, you know, in Washington, when I'm sure he sees a lot of his friends who are lawyers for all those big lobbyists everybody hates drive bigger cars. So I'll close out with just a couple. Capital spending. When all this talk about railroads care about profits over people, all companies care about profits, but safety is good business. You know, it's not just because we hope they're all good people. If you look at the gray, that is the spending on the system, on the network, and that has been pretty consistent. You see more volatility in the blue, non-network things. Part of that is railroads don't buy locomotives right now. They're going to wait to see what the fuel will be. Railroads have ceased buying rail cars to any great degree because financial institutions buy them, like GATX or Wells Fargo. So the story of looking at the capital spending as a top number is really not the smart way of looking at it. I feel like Mitch McConnell. Sorry. So railroads, I was told as a young analyst that railroad safety was a great way, a proxy of really seeing for railroads any good. It's not just because, again, you know, to derail is incredibly expensive. It's destructive of your schedule. It tears up the track and equipment. You know, old timers, when I first started, when my hair was a different color, said, if you want a shorthand for how good a railroad is, look at their safety record. And frankly, they've gotten better all the time since this century. But if you also look back to deregulation, it's really when it started. But they seem to kind of plateau in the last few years. East Palestine is an anomaly. It is not indicative of anything. But you still see there's still a need to refocus. If it did one thing positive, two things. One, it added $1.4 billion to a Rust Belt town. And the second thing would be that it really got people to refocus and say, maybe, I don't think they took their eye off the ball. That was an unusual incident. But clearly, the pressure is on to improve these numbers. And they had gotten better and better. And as you see, they kind of flattened. And so there's that. This is a slide. This is an STB slide. And I don't have a title, but I don't know why. But it is looking at the spread between the weighted average cost of capital and the return on invested capital of U.S.-only railroads since the Staggers Act deregulated the industry in 1980 up through 22. I don't think 23 numbers are out yet. That's also a byproduct of the government. It's 2024 solidly, but we'll wait a bit. The key here is if you invest $1 and you get back 80 cents, that's destruction that's a destruction of value. The railroad industry in the black is destroyed value because they're not getting back the money they're putting in the combination of the cost of their equity and the cost of their debt, the weighted average cost of capital. In the 90s or in the 80s, there was actually a pretty clear, throw out a couple of those aberrational years, a clear set of improvement as the railroads began to shed non-rail businesses and focus their money back on fixing the track where they had been paying up deferred maintenance. That plateaued around the turn of the century. That's the impact of the big four mergers, which were incredibly complicated, much more so than anybody told us when they did them. And now they've gone into, even though it's not black, I'm going to call it the black, the yellow, they're earning back $1.05, $1.12, maybe even up to $1.15 on the dollar they invest. That's what healthy companies do. That's really important. And let's see if I can show you on the next slide. So that was supposed to be animated. My friends at Oliver Wyman destroyed my animation. I worked so hard on it. But it was supposed to go very slowly and show you if your return on invested capital is more than your cost of capital, then you have sort of license to invest more, right? You can continue to spend. You get a stronger plant. You get better equipment. You're not delaying or deferring any maintenance. You're safer, you're faster, you're more reliable, you're more sustainable. And then you have more money and you can spend more. That's the virtuous circle. On the other side, and this is the railroads of the 70s, if your cost is below your cost of capital in the 70s, you would take that money out of the rail industry and you would invest it in your non-rail assets that all had to be done. So you had, out here in Texas, you had the BNSF, what were they, Steve? There was Plum Creek Timber, El Paso Natural Gas. You would exploit the land that you had that had it. Canadian Pacific, my favorite example, they invested in China, not the country, but the plate making capability. So they did anything they could to get out of the rail business, and then they were deregulated in that turn. But if you get in that cycle, the opposite of the virtuous cycle, you get lower capital spending, which means you have a weaker plant, which ultimately means you have poorer returns, right? You have more accidents, you have more problems, which leads you to disinvest more. Oliver Wyman and my good friends did a report a few years ago that said there's $61 billion of money left on the table because the railroads up until the end of the decade. So because railroads are not more customer-centric. So I look at it the other way. If they could only get there, right, and they have the means to do this, and I think they have the motivation to do this if they get through this fight with Ancora, I think there's a lot of money to be picked up in restoring share, et cetera, and ending those three questions, those three body blows. That's my conference, I guess, taken off this slide, was the North American Association of Rail Shippers gave me the Railroad of the Year award in 2019. It was the best honor of my career. It was Railroad Person of the Year. It was given to me Texas. It said I was the Railroad Man of the Year, but by the time I got back and opened it in New York, it was Person, so we'd corrected it in the air. But I'm also the only 2-year holder of the belt, because there was one. Bruce Mann, many of you may know him at the Port of Houston, got the award in 2020, but we didn't get together, so, I got to keep it. Anyway, I'm done with my presentation. Thank you. Sorry if I was a little chippy here. It's hot and sweaty. I'm a little tired. But I really appreciate being here. It's been a long time coming, Peter. So, and one of the times I was lying down, you wouldn't have seen me at all. Maybe that was better. So I don't know. If you have any questions, I'm here to take them. Yes, sir. Thank you.
I'll come say it to you. You can repeat it.
Yeah.
So you obviously went through the Ancora deck.
Yes.
They made a couple of allusions. All right, so Tony, you obviously went through the Ancora deck, all 139 slides. 193, sorry, for those of you in the audience. They made a lot of references to John Orr being not quite equal to Hunter Harrison. They drew out some legal claims. I think they also had an allusion to like maybe doing some alternative power with like a nuclear reactor. I would love to get your thoughts on Ancora.
So they were really comparing, the Norfolk Southern hired a CN guy who was working at CPKC as their chief transformation officer post-merger. So Ancora said they hired this guy, John Orr, who had been vice president of transportation at CN, who had been at Hunter Camp, who had been one of the initial first team in the diaspora from the mothership, when Jamie, who had been at CSX, was not yet a vice president. So they're just a different generation, right? And they'd said that John Orr is not good at his job. He has a hot temper. To me, in all the stuff they were saying, they weren't comparing to Hunter, right? They were just saying he was closer to Hunter, and I told you that Hunter had to be reminded who he was. And that's also, Hunter was older and he was much younger, but John is of the middle generation, equivalent to Mike Corey over at CSX. Jamie is the generation younger, and I mean more generation going through the railroad, not necessarily age. It's sort of a despicable attack, but when you are working with, and no reporters here, right? When you're working with the team they brought in and the guy who used to work at CSX, and you're attacking you're not writing. Okay. Thank you, Jim. When they attacked John Orr, who is now currently the CEO of Norfolk Southern, which could be the shortest tenure, the votes May 9th, they attacked him because he was the old school, he was a yeller, he's a screamer, he is the traditional militaristic top-down white male yelling guy that kept the railroad business alive for a long time. The world has clearly changed, and they're saying this is the inappropriate guy. If those of you who, what I wrote was, it's like as if Crystal Palace had a howitzer. That's a glass house hurling big stones, because if they look at who they have a person. I was at CSX where this person recently left, and the mood, everybody came up to me in my 2 days in Jacksonville and said, "Oh, it's so great to work here now." I'm like, "Well, what's changed?" I will just leave that to your imagination. The chief marketing officer told me that people in the accounting department that he did not deal with, I mean, low-level people came up and high-fived him in the hallway. They never dealt with the COO. They don't deal with the CMO. They were just happy. That was just what Hunter does. So I used to also think this, and keep this in mind when you look at that case and all that, is that I thought, speaking of World War II, that if you worked at CN, it was like Band of Brothers. You could come from any walk of life. You could be a bank president and a soda jerk, if you remember Best Years of Our Lives. But the ramp went down and you stormed the beach and you got shot at by the Germans. So you come back, you have once a year, you get together, it's like the greatest thing. You were a band of brothers. and I had the wrong HBO series. It's Game of Thrones. Hunter took the alpha males, almost entirely male, and put them in a cage and shook it up and sort of said, 2 go in, 1 comes out. And so there's not all, there's going to be no reunion party in 10 years or 20 years. You know, there may be, people may be visiting people in jail, but there's no reunion party. And so the idea that they're saying this guy has done these things, and they sound bad. I'm a friend of his, to be honest, and of Corey at CSX. And, you know, I tend to befriend the operating guys because I know nothing about rail operations, so I like to ask them questions. You know, and I know Jamie too. It's just, to me, it's kind of crazy to go after it this way, because this is a man, if Google Jamie's parking lot, for example, I paved Jamie's girlfriend's parking lot was a thing that the union people did in Winnipeg. They all have baggage. They've all been fired by Hunter. They were all brought back by Hunter. There are differences. John Orr is a senior leader who was critical, who Keith did not want to lose at CP Casey. To me, you know, you look at the people who endorse him. Of all the board people out there, Hunter Harrison made every railroad better when he went there. But leaving every railroad, they got better still. Because he didn't have a marketing person when he was running CP. He didn't care about customers. He's going to give you a product, you're going to like it or not, right? He didn't say, how can we make your business better? He didn't care about that. I mean, he would say that when he was here. So when he had to leave and somebody came in and they were kinder and gentler, that's what the person I'm going to mention in a second. Keith Creel said, we're going to re-engage with all the stakeholder groups that we've been ignoring, including communities, labor, shippers, and regulators, and we're going to pivot to growth. That's where that phrase came from. And so that's a fundamental difference. Hunter, may he rest in peace, was the bull in a china shop, and then you needed somebody else to come and make a new store out of it. And the person who did it the most and the best, and is in the Hall of Fame in my book for it, was Claude Mongeau, who came into CN afterwards and turned that into the mothership. Right? Made that a growth machine, not just a cost-cutting machine, not just a machine where the Illinois delegation could not wait when they thought Hunter was going to try to buy an Eastern U.S. railroad to get back at him after what he did at the J. I mean, he left so many bridges burning, it was like a World War II movie, right? So then you come in and you solve that, and this guy, Claude Mongeau, did. And then he got throat cancer and retired at like 52. He's on the board of Norfolk Southern. He supports John Orr. He was the boss of John Orr and Jamie Boychuk. He supports the board of things, and people are, and the activists are saying, well, he's too close to those people. Yeah, he was their boss. You know, to me, that's the grown-up in the room. The other one we should listen to when they talk about this, Keith Creel, right? John Orr and Joe Hinrichs, who at CSX, who had hired one of them and then dispensed with his services. That's somebody to talk to. And finally, Pat Ottensmeyer from the Kansas City Southern here, who had hired, those guys are supportive of the current management team. Those are the grown-ups in the room. You know, they're not banding together because all the old CEOs, I mean, they don't do that. That's, to me, you know, so because that makes sense, Ancora is now trying to chip away at the reputation of these people, which I think is despicable. And also, they're wrapping themselves in the Ohio flag and talking about safety. Again, railroads don't compete on safety, and you know, this could have happened to any railroad. And I know that Ancora didn't wrap themselves in the Rhode Island flag when they attacked Hasbro. It's a very little flag, it's a very little state. Hard to wrap it, but you know, it's just so cynical to me. Like, who do you think is going to buy that? And unfortunately, some people might. May 9th is the vote. And the last thing to remember is it's not like a vote here. You know, when we talk about running for governor of Texas, most people in Texas don't leave, you know, obviously not in Texas, you know, stand up for Texas. But I mean, you know, you could go and say, I did this and I did that. The long-term holders of a stock, when it's under attack, often are compelled to sell that stock because it's gone up 20%. And they've hit their fiduciary duties. So your supporters of the shareholders might not be there. And so the people who buy it up 20% need it to go up 4 more percent, right? They make short-term gains. So, you know, a lot of times CSX had this happen when they were attacked, is they treated this literally like it was a gubernatorial campaign. And it is an election. But imagine also if you had an election where 25% of the votes were passive, you know, the proxy guys can go out and make these decisions. It's sort of saying, oh, this whole neighborhood, I've got their vote, literally. So it's a crazy system. Pay attention to it because it'll have ramifications for railroads everywhere. Thank you, guys.